Hello, thank you for joining the call today. This is Lynn Lonsway. I am the Executive Director for the International Bullying Prevention Association. We're thrilled to have Dr. Julie McDaniel here today with us to present a session titled Beyond ACEs, Why Trauma-Informed Practices Are a Call to Action. Julie has worked with us on different levels with the International Bullying Prevention Association for some time, and I'm thrilled to say that she's a great colleague and friend, so it's an honor to have her present today. She currently is the Social Media Director for IBPA. She's also an Advanced Certified Trauma Practitioner and Trainer for Starr Commonwealth, and she's a Student Safety and Wellbeing Consultant for Oakland Schools. To say she is qualified for this session is an understatement. It's a treat to have you here, Dr. McDaniel, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. It's so great to be with all of you. I want to, the purpose of all of this is really to spark a conversation, because a conversation that's really overdue. So what I'm going to take you through is really, for those of you who are trauma informed, this will be a little refresher. For those of you who are brand new to this, this will give you a foundational knowledge. What I want to do is to really explain how trauma-informed practices are actually a call to action. So first of all, what is a call to action? Call to action is something that motivates us to do something, and a lot of times it tells us how to do something. And that's actually what I'm trying to do today. What we're going to do is go from trauma-informed to advocacy and awareness. A lot of times people think that this trauma awareness, that's good enough. And actually, what I'm hoping to do is to make the case for trauma awareness actually leads to a responsibility to restore and to build resilience, and then finally to become agents of change and advocacy. Before we even begin, I'm going to say this probably 3 or 4 times, is that it's important for us in all endeavor, whether it be educational endeavor or trauma-informed practices, bully prevention, anything that we do, especially with children, is that we fulfill 2 basic needs. The first is the need for safety. And I've been highly informed and have learned so much from Stephen Porges' work on social engagement theory, and what he talks about is the neurobiology of safety. That safety is not just a physical sense of safety, it's actually something that it happens within the body, and it includes psychological safety and relational safety and emotional safety. And it is so much a part of who we are. We also know that safety is an imperative. It's a prerequisite for optimal learning. It's a prerequisite for so many things. A lot of times we think about this brain of ours, especially overeducated adults that do a lot of overthinking. We think that the brain's most important function is to think, and actually it's not. The brain's most important function is to keep us safe. And so if it is not safe, that there's a perception of danger, the brain actually shuts down in a way that we are not open to learning, we're not optimal learners. And so that sense of safety is absolutely something that's a part of us. The second basic need is the need for community. Because we are complex mammals, the most complex mammals on the planet, we actually thrive in tribes. We were never meant to be isolated. In fact, a lot of times we'll find safety in community. If you just picture 20 of us sitting around a table and a light fixture falls from the ceiling, no one is injured, and the first thing that we're going to do is look at one another and say, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay?" That's what we do. And so this sense of safety, we actually can find it within one another. When the brain perceives ourselves to be safe and we're together, that's actually optimal learning, and that's the place where we thrive and are happy. Trauma is a disruption of both of those things. Starr Commonwealth defines trauma as any experience that leaves a person feeling hopeless, helpless, fearing for life or survival, and for safety. So I underlined experience because I think it's an important distinction. A lot of people think that it's an event. Actually, an event happens, and it's the way that we experience this. So there could be a traumatic event with 3 people involved, and each of the 3 people are going to experience that trauma differently. The other part of the definition that's important is the hopeless and helpless part. So that is where you see that's a disruption of the sense of safety, a disruption of a sense of community. The brain goes into this survival mode where it's very difficult for it to think about anything except becoming safe again. And that's what trauma does to our brain. Trauma is also, the experience of trauma is either real or perceived, and that's an important thing for people to understand. When you move from it being an event to being an experience, and then you understand that there's a perception, that's the most important thing. We stop telling children there's no reason to be afraid, because if they are afraid, that perception is the traumatic experience. So it's no less than looking at this picture of this person looking to the left-hand side of the screen. But if you turn it on its side, it's the word liar. And so in trauma work, we always remain, two steps back. We try not to make assumptions. We remain curious and open, and we understand that it's really not the details that are happening. It's about the experience of the trauma. And we as adults listening to children do not need to know the details, and I'll explain more about that. So there are different ways that we're exposed to trauma. It could be directly. It could be a car accident where you're driving, or you could be assaulted. But we also are exposed to trauma by witnessing these things. So if you witness someone getting into a car accident, if you're in the car, so it's not actually the driver, if you see something on television, a lot of times some of the things that the media portrays, where we see things looped over and over again, we are exposed to trauma. There's relational. If you have a sick sibling, or if you have a friend, family member that's going through things, just knowing people and loving people that are going through trauma exposes you also to trauma. And the fourth kind is the type of trauma that we all as practitioners are susceptible to. When we are in the field that we do, and this is whether you are a parent, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a therapist, we hear details of trauma. We hear the pain of children because we are also trauma impacted people. We have double jeopardy. And so what happens when children are telling us over and over again, we hear details, we are indirectly exposed to trauma. And that trauma can actually be no less than if you're directly involved in it. And I'm going to talk about the impact of that as we go on. There are different types of trauma. Type 1 is just a single exposure. Type 2 is one type of exposure repeated. But what I really want to focus on is complex cumulative trauma today. It's also called developmental trauma disorder. And the reason that I want to talk about that is because I think that it's very rare that we're going to really experience type 1 and type 2. And I think that you might agree with me by the end of this webinar. Important to note here that we have become, when we become trauma informed, sometimes we forget that anxiety or acute stress is not such a bad thing. In fact, because the brain functions to keep us safe, if we go through something, our body is going to respond. The brain tells the body to respond. That's normal, that's good. It's actually protecting ourselves, or protecting the body from additional damage. That a normal reaction, even to a small traumatic event, could be 4 to 6 weeks. When it is prolonged, it becomes exaggerated. And when it's exaggerated, it actually causes irreparable damage to the body. There's a dysregulation of stress chemistry, increased activation of the sympathetic nervous system, and many other systems of the body that become damaged because of that hyperarousal. The stress response system is a very important mechanism in trauma. An event happens, and so we're exposed to a traumatic event, and then something goes into action. So the first thing that happens is that we are startled. We have this moment where the body is on alert, but we kind of pause. At that point, the stress response system kicks in, and adrenaline and cortisol start pumping. That is a normal response. But if you take type 3 trauma, that developmental trauma disorder or cumulative trauma, what you what we find is that children under toxic stress, children who have one thing happen to them after another, that cortisol and adrenaline is pumping through a still developing brain. And that's why childhood trauma is so damaging and so concerning, because it is, while the body is developing, these counteract any kind of neurodevelopment. There are 4 different ways that trauma impacts us. This is from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So physically, what we see are unexplained sensations, including pain. Children will complain of headaches and stomach aches. Their sleeping and eating disturbances, whether it's not enough or too much. There's low energy and there's increased arousal, which is a great time to talk about trauma being just a range of emotions, a range of feelings, a range of sensations and symptoms, so that you could go from low energy to increased arousal and all be under the impact of trauma. Emotionally, we see depression and fear, and we can also see anxiety and panic. There's numbness, irritability, and anger. There's this feeling of totally being out of control. But it goes back to that definition of trauma, that we are hopeless and helpless. We do feel out of control. And then there's avoidance. Cognitively, when we're in schools and we see our kids, we see distraction, we see decrease in concentration, there's a memory lapse, and there's difficulty with decisions. I want to point out here that there was a great study by Weinstein in 2000 that looked at the symptoms of ADHD and PTSD and found that so many of them were overlapping. And so in the trauma community, there's an increased call for trauma identification and intervention before we label a child with ADHD and medicate especially. Behaviorally, we see compulsion, we see substance abuse, we see eating disorders, impulsive self-destructive behaviors, disassociation, changes in interpersonal relationships, isolation, avoidance, social withdrawal, and then because trauma is this huge range, we also see kids with hostility, with aggression, they're argumentative, they feel threatened. So at Starr Commonwealth and in all trauma practice, the primary dictate is do no harm. So once you become trauma informed, it's important for us to be very mindful about some of the things that we say or have said in the past, or some of the practices that we have, because we actually may be adding more trauma to children's life. So what we want to do is to put our feet in the shoes of our children. And they ask us, if you don't think what I think and feel what I feel, experience what I experience, see what I see when I look at myself, others in the world, how can you possibly know what's best for me? So what matters most in trauma work is to remember that trauma changes the way people view themselves, others in the world. It is something that happens. You don't make a conscious decision to decide to look at things differently. It happens. And that, with the symptoms, really urges us to replace saying and asking what's wrong with what happened. So when it's what's wrong, it's a value put on this. Trauma is a normal response to something that we experience. And we have to start looking at what our children are experiencing as a result of something that's happened to them. And it puts us out of this position of judgment that we often want to be in. Well, let's talk a little bit about adverse childhood experiences. And I know that there are people who know a lot about them. Some people are just starting to hear about them. So I want to give you a little taste of that so that you know why it's important for us to move on. So between 1995 and 1997, Anda and Filiti, under the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, they studied 17,000 people. It was the first time that there was a study on the impact of what we go through as children into adulthood. And this was a pretty privileged population. It was 75% white, 75% with at least some college. Interestingly enough, 46% were 60 and above. And so they didn't really expect to see a lot of trauma, but they were surprised. What they found is that there were 3 broad categories of adverse childhood experiences, things that people went through as children. Physically or abuse, there was physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and neglect, physical and emotional, household dysfunction, everything from mental illness and an incarcerated relative to a mother treating violently, substance abuse, and divorce. Probably the most impactful finding of this study was that they found that it wasn't an added thing. So if you went through two ACEs, you weren't 2 times more likely. It was an exponential risk, so that every adverse childhood experience that you would go through, it exponentially made you more vulnerable and more probable to engage in high-risk behaviors and to have some things happen to you in adulthood, physical. So this is actually, I pulled this from the CDC website. They have really fabulous graphic representations. And I think I wanted to add here that I know that there's a resource sheet for this, but on all these slides, if you want to pause this, when you're looking at this, you can see that I put in all of the websites so that you can go there and find really fabulous research and evidence-based and free downloadable resources for you. So adverse childhood experiences, Anda and Felidi found that what we go through as children makes a long-lasting impact on injury, mental health, maternal health, infectious disease, chronic disease, risky behaviors, and opportunities. As an example, they found that people that had several ACEs being adverse childhood experiences, the more that people had ACEs, they also had more fractures and bones broken in their lifetime. There was more cancer and diabetes. There were more teen paternity and maternity. There was substance abuse. There was also less college graduation. So there were opportunities as an adult, so financial instability, job insecurity, and less income. So what the CDC said, and this is a beautiful triangle because we love triangles, adverse childhood experiences lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, which leads to social, emotional, cognitive impairment, which leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors, which leads to disease, disability, and social problems, and ultimately early death. And what they found was that people who had 6 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, had a 20-year life expectancy less than those who did not have any childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences. But we're growing and we're learning, and the CDC now, their triangle actually includes things that happen before childhood, which is where we get to why we're here today. So at the bottom of their triangle now is historical trauma. So there's a generational embodiment of trauma that actually impacts us before we ever enter the world. There are social conditions and local contexts that make an impact on us before we enter our families. Then there's adverse childhood experiences and so on. What we've also found is that there are other types of trauma. There's historical trauma, racial trauma, institutional trauma, refugee trauma, and more. We're going to go through these so that you have an idea. What I want you to understand, if you haven't yet, is that if we only look at adverse childhood experiences, what we're doing is we're denying the fact that people are going through much more than just what's happening in the home. And also by looking at the other types of trauma, we see that they're blurred lines and it's not easily categorized. Here's an example. In the 1980s, we started looking at historical trauma, and this was definitely focused on Native Americans. Historical trauma is the re-experiencing of traumatic events by an individual or community over multiple generations. What we found is that cultural memories are passed from generation to generation. The impact is altered every generation, which is very interesting. So what that means is something happens to a generation, and then the next generation, they know what's happened, but they manifest the trauma differently. And so the trauma looks different from generation to generation when you're looking at historical trauma. And the way that they looked at that is by seeing the impact of colonization, relocation, assimilation, and then current things that are happening. There's also racial trauma. Racial trauma, the work really, the great amount of work done on racial trauma is with African Americans. I think that about 2000 is where it really became a really robust part of research. It's race-based traumatic experiences, and some examples are experiencing or witnessing racial harassment, ethno-violence, so violence against a group based on ethnicity or race. There's microaggressions, which is, for those of you who don't know, that's still an act of violence. It's a microaggression, but it could be something that hateful language or small actions that aren't necessarily can't see wounds, but they definitely leave an impact. There's constant threat of racial and ethnic discrimination in certain areas. And then there's institutional racism. So while we're on that, I want to share with you what institutional trauma is. Institutional trauma is deliberate actions or acts of omission, which means that we just didn't know. But just didn't think about that, we're actually inflicting trauma. And so people come to these institutions thinking that they're going to get protection and support, and maybe they need these institutions for their survival, and they find that they are turned away and they're betrayed. Currently, we have some things. I wanted to give you some examples. The treatment of asylum seekers is a great example of institutional trauma, where people come to a new country and they expect refuge, they expect safety, they need protection, and they are turned away, or they're separated from their families. There's proposed policy in some states in the United States right now on gender disclosure, and what that means is, if you consider schools being the only safe haven for some of our kids, especially our LGBTQ kids, if they are not in a supportive home, they come to school and it's a place where they can be. There's proposed policy on gender disclosure, which is going to require schools, if passed, schools to disclose the gender of their students as they have self-reported to parents. And there are only two options, male and female. Another institutional trauma that's currently happening is the treatment of sexual assault victims in colleges and universities and in the military. And that happens because a sexual assault victim will come to a college, come to military officials and say, this happened to me. And because of the college's reputation and because they don't want to diminish the standing of the college or the military service, the people who have come there for support and for protection are denied. Refugee trauma is very complex. I'll give you an example. So first of all, there's the traumatic stress that's involved of getting to the new country. People face war, persecution, flight, and migration. Then there's the resettlement stress, which comes from inadequate housing and family separation. Then there's acculturation stress. So once they get there, so keeping in mind the safety, the need for safety, the need for community. So the people have left because of safety issues. They've left their communities. They come to a new country. There's cultural misunderstandings and inability to connect. So in seeking safety, they still have this huge need for safety or for community. And then there's isolation stress, which happens when groups are denied access into a community. There's bullying and harassment and loss of social status. Intergenerational trauma is different than historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma they started studying this in the 1950s on Holocaust survivors. And what they look at are the trauma, how it impacts the present within generations of family, generations of the same family that experienced the trauma years or generations ago. They think that that's related to immigration trauma now. And so now there's another great example about how all of these lines are blurred. But the difference between intergenerational trauma and historical trauma is that they believe that intergenerational trauma is passed between parent to child because of the parents' treatment when they themselves were children. So historical trauma is generation to generation, manifesting itself differently. Intergenerational trauma is really about parent and child. There are emerging types of trauma that we're looking at now, which I think are fascinating and really important. And I think that what it's doing is showing us that our growing knowledge about trauma is helping us understand that those basic needs for safety and community spread into the healing for trauma. That we need to start looking at what these individuals and families are experiencing and how that's making an impact on the community. I'll explain. So one is organizational trauma. I just finished the book by Vivian and Horman, and they talk about organizational trauma. So there is trauma that comes from people externally walking into organizations and committing violent acts. There's definitely an organizational trauma that occurs. But what they were specifically looking at are places that that deal with trauma-impacted people. And because they're not mindful about the impact of that, of hearing detail after detail every day, that the toxicity, the toxic stress actually becomes absorbed by the organization. An example that they give is a law organization, a legal organization specifically for sexual assault victims. And what they ended up disbanding because they weren't tending to themselves, that they didn't understand how mindful that they needed to be about how contagious this trauma is. And we're going to talk a little bit about compassion fatigue in just a few minutes. The other type of emerging trauma is community trauma. So it's not just about violence within communities or even violent acts that are committed within communities by outsiders, but it's also caused by social, economic, and physical structures that perpetuate inequity. An example would be the train station in Detroit. It became kind of a symbol of decay, and so while there were people inside that city that never left, that continued to fight, the most resilient people on earth, I'm highly biased, this train station became a symbol of that. And so that community trauma can be found in failing infrastructures. It could be social structures. It could be the loss of work inside our urban centers especially. So here's a whole bunch of trauma that we're experiencing. It's way beyond ACEs. SAMHSA came up with 6 guiding principles that really should be the torch that we're all holding when we decide to do trauma-informed work. The first thing that we must do is establish a sense of safety. And what is important to understand is that this safety is not just for the families or the children that we're serving. It is about the people who are working in these organizations. So safety is the first most important consideration. The next 3 are all about community. SAMHSA understands the importance of regaining that sense of community, that's really how we start to heal, that there's trust in there, there's mutual support, there's collaboration and mutuality. Once the sense of safety is restored, once a community is strengthened, now we can start helping people remember their voice and their power and their choice. And that is, we can't just stop at having people become aware of what's happened to them and how it's made an impact on them. We have to help them remember how powerful they really are in order for them to move on. And then this is my favorite part, because we're getting so much smarter. We realize that in order for people to truly heal, we have to tend to cultural, historical, and gender issues. If trauma leaves us with a warped sense of ourselves and the world and people around us, we have to be reminded of who we are. And so that responsiveness, part of the healing of trauma, involves bringing back the culture, reviving the culture, reminding people of those traditions and sacred things. We help people, we remember and we honor the things that generations have gone through before them. So the way that we heal the impact of trauma, again, we start first with safety and community. So Michael Unger, who is a resilient scientist, he wrote this great book called Change Your World that I just finished. It's so good. He says that it's frightening to think about how predestined our lives can be, but it's also enlightening to think how easy it can be to ensure mental and physical health. So Michael Unger reminds us that yes, if we know only about trauma awareness, it can be so overwhelming. But if we understand how easy it is actually to break the cycle of trauma, and just in understanding what happens to us at a physiological level, that all of that gives us back the power that we had. But and so we're moving now into resilience and restoration. So in 2017, the CDC declared said that bullying was an adverse childhood experience. So that's one thing about adverse childhood experiences. There are much more than the original 10, and bullying is one of them. And the CDC recommended these 4 things for schools and agencies as a way to really help kids who were targets of bullying and the bullying themselves and the whole school community. One is trauma-informed practices, but they also talked about social-emotional learning. At Starr Commonwealth, we believe that social-emotional learning is as important as academic content knowledge, at least as important. There's also mindfulness, and a lot of really good work is being done in mindfulness, but what I wanted to do is just to spend a little bit of time with restorative practices. So the International Institute for Restorative Practices founder Ted Wachtell says that people are happier and more likely to make positive changes when those in authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. In restorative practices, the goal is safe and supportive communities. And what we know about communities is that the backbone of those communities are relationships. And so 80% of the efforts that we have toward restorative practices in schools and communities is building and strengthening relationships, because we know that that is the way that communities thrive. 20% of our efforts are repairing harm when those relationships are harmed, when people are harmed. The second important thing to take away from restorative practices for those of you who might be new to that is that restorative practices really urges us to separate the deed from the doer. And what we do in restorative practices is we realize we go back to tribal wisdom, that we are a whole intact community. If someone does something inside our community that harms us, it doesn't mean that they have lost value as a human being. It also doesn't mean that we just exclude them and then we wipe our hands and we say, well, that was taken care of. What we do in restorative practices is we understand that the value of this human being is not defined by what they've done, just like trauma does not define us. And so what we do is not just say, well, you're a great person and you didn't mean to. We definitely hold them accountable. In fact, it's high expectations, but we give a whole lot of support to that person as well. And restorative practices are making a great difference in our schools and communities. Once we start to restore the harm, we can also do this through the building of resilience. Now, resilience, there's lots of science behind this. The Starr Commonwealth definition is nice and simple. It's the ability to achieve positive outcomes mentally, socially, emotionally, spiritually, despite adversity. Harvard has done a lot of work on resilience, and actually they have 21 empirically derived characteristics of resilient people. What I want to highlight, though, is how to cultivate that resilience. A lot of times we have these great programs, research and evidence-based, or we've got these great ideas and we want to just, we know that resilience capacity will help us in adversity. But Harvard says, let's just take a step back. What they found was that the single most common factor of children developing resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supported parent, caregiver, or other adult. What that means is that the kids who gained the most resilience in their studies were the ones that had the trusted relationship, that solid relationship with another adult. We're finding this in schools. We are seeing schools are understanding that every child in a school has to have a trusted adult. And I'm watching in Oakland County, Michigan, how that's happening, where we know that in order for us to have optimal learners, in order for us to have kids that thrive and that are happy, they have to have that adult relationship at school. Some kids have nothing at home, and so school becomes that safe haven. Other factors for cultivating resilience is self-efficacy and perceived control. What that means is we instill that idea in our children that they can do it, the little engine that could. They also need to understand that while they don't have control over the things that happen to them, they do have control over how they respond to them. And that is a very big deal for kids to learn. And that's something that we teach through social emotional learning. We also give kids opportunities to strengthen their adaptive skills. So we don't just hand them a tool and say, this is going to work. We don't even hand them a toolbox. What we say is, here's a toolbox and here's ways that people have used them. Do you like the way that do they work in this this situation? Does it feel right for you? Is it a good fit? Do we need to adapt those tools? And then we mobilize sources of faith, hope, and cultural traditions. We bring the whole child into schools if we're going to start building resilience. We need to make sure that we mobilize those sources, because we know resilient people have a true north. They have a purpose. They have high faith. They're spiritual people, and as we know that's not necessarily religious. We want to start putting theory into practice. So Bettina Love, who wrote a great book on abolitionist teaching, said, without theory, the movable mountain of injustice and oppression seems too big and immobile. But theory helps us understand that our job is not to move mountains, but to outmaneuver them. And so that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time together talking about, is we're going to outmaneuver these mountains. So we're moving from trauma awareness through resilience and restoration, and finally to advocacy and agency. But before we do this, I want to take this opportunity to talk about the things that don't work. And we really need to either stop doing them or put them within a systemic, comprehensive program. In 2016, a national panel underneath the NIH looked at the things that were not working with bullying prevention, things that they could find no evidence of a positive impact. In fact, some of them had a negative impact. And here are some of them with a little added. So first of all, zero tolerance policies. We know for sure that they don't work. If we are truly trying to heal our communities, we have to have room for people to make amends. We need to have room for people to get second chances. We need to have room for them to restore the harm that they've done. Zero tolerance policies, we know way more about them. They should not be implemented at all in schools right now, because we know that the school to prison pipeline is real. We've got research behind that. We also need to stop giving advice to kids without showing them how it's done. Adults are very good at doing that. We need to stop focusing only on students when we're talking about reform efforts. Mark Brackett in the Ruler program, he always says that this is adult development first. We need to really have that mindset when it comes to trauma-informed practices in all things that have to do with children. We have to stop piecemeal efforts unless they're a part of a systemic, comprehensive program. Days or months or weeks dedicated to something, motivational speakers, assemblies, all of those things actually can bring more harm. An example would be if a motivational speaker came out and moved kids to say, be who you are. A child is urged and motivated to come out in a place that is not safe. It actually can bring much more harm. And so if we don't have structures in place before, during, and after these, if it's not a part of a systemic reform, we really shouldn't engage in that. And then finally, peer-only conflict resolution. Adults need to learn how to resolve their own conflicts, and then we need to model it, and then we can teach it. But when we leave kids to resolve their own conflict without tools, without modeling, it's doomed to fail. So now we move to advocacy and agency. Always the first consideration, safety and community. So we are actually moving and we're growing, which is really exciting. So I love the way that we have all embraced growth mindset. The whole power of yet. I'm not good at math yet. And in growth mindset, we know that it's everyday learners who seek growth and development. We teach our children, we're trying to learn by it, that we slow and steady wins the race, that we try hard, we learn, we fail, we learn, we fail, we succeed. Benefit mindset is the next iteration of that. It's where we're pushing ourselves into the community. It's not enough for us to be the best. We want to do good, and we want to be well. So what it does is it helps us to understand the importance of us to meaningfully contribute to our communities. Ash Buchanan is the champion of this. What his quote that I put in here is that a benefit mindset is a purpose-driven mindset that redefines success from being the best in the world to being the best for the world. Restorative practices is also moving and growing. It's a great thing that with the smarter that we get about trauma and its impact, the smarter that we're getting about moving us forward. So the traditional questions were what rules have been broken, who is to blame, what punishment do they deserve? Now we move away from that punitive mindset to effective questions and the restorative mindset. What happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought of since? Give kids a space for amends, a space for remorse. Who has been affected by what you've done, in what way, and what do you think needs to be done to make things right? Well, in the restorative justice movement, there is a new idea that we need to take this and bring it out into society and our communities. Well, if we start thinking about what social circumstances may have promoted the harmful behavior, now we can look at our society and communities for the structures that are preventing us and actually promoting harm being done to us individually. We ask what structural similarities exist between this incident and the others like it. And we ask ourselves what measures could prevent future occurrences. Pretty exciting. So we go from reacting to trauma, to responding to trauma, to building resilience, to restoring harm, and now we're going to transform our communities to try to prevent that harm. Kate the Wine Garden has given us a really great little way to look at the work that we do, and I want to share this with you because I think it's really important. Being trauma informed is not enough. She has a 2x2 grid, empowered and disempowered, aware and unaware, and I'm going to explain that just a little bit more. Where we want to be is in that first window, and most of us are there. We're competent, we're effective, we understand the impact of trauma, and we're empowered to do something about it. There are far too many of us that are in the unaware 2 and 3 window, where if you're unaware and empowered, children will come to you and you won't be looking for the signs of trauma. You'll see chronic absenteeism as a problem of the parents. You'll see continued complaints of headaches and stomach aches, and you won't see that it's trauma, and actually you could do something about it to intervene in that trauma. And so malpractice then occurs. Or you could be unaware and disempowered, where it's happening and you don't even have any idea. The most concerning window is the one that I wanted to share with you, which is 4, which is where we are all vulnerable. So if we are trauma informed and we are working in systems that prevent us from doing the work that we know needs to be done, what happens is our own resilience starts to wane. And when we are hearing details of trauma every day and we are living trauma impacted lives, what happens is we start absorbing what's happened, what is being told to us every day. We start to suffer from compassion fatigue and burnout. Not only is it a terrible thing for us because we know the impact of trauma on our psychophysiological state, but we know that those children need us so badly. And so how important it is us to gather strength from one another. And that's the last part of this, is rethinking the policies, practices, and protocols in our schools and in our communities that may be contributing to the trauma. So just knowing that ACEs is not enough for this mindset, and understanding that we can do very little outside the family to prevent these ACEs, there's lots of trauma that we can attend to. Here's some examples, and some of them are quite provocative. We need to prohibit in-school arrests. They are disproportionately aimed towards students of color. 70 to 75% of our students of color are arrested in school. That's apart from the stigmatizing that's done for children who are arrested in school and the trauma that it causes to the school community. Keeping in mind that the school's most important function is to keep kids safe and to create a place where everyone belongs. We need to see student participation in active shooter training, especially our young children. At first I was saying, oh, we should rethink that. We shouldn't rethink that. We should stop doing that. There is absolutely no reason for our children to participate in this. We need to remember what Mr. Rogers taught us, is that the children are going to look to the helpers. We teach them that. And if we're not there to help them, there'll be other adults. They do not need this. And while I'm on this little rant, we need to rethink school violence preparedness. Not to to demand differences, but to truly rethink it. This is a community conversation. What is it that we really want kids to know and be able to do in the event of a crisis? And this is parents, this is families, this is community members, and our law enforcement and our school officials. We need to hire additional staff in our agencies and in our schools. And I know that this is, I want to put this out there. I want this on the record. We need to start demanding this. We need fewer students assigned to special education teachers. We need fewer students on caseloads. For those people who are dealing with the most trauma-affected children, our counselors, social workers, and school psychs. Here's some more examples. We need to embed restorative practices throughout trauma-sensitive schools. So the assumption is that we all become trauma sensitive and we embed restorative practices so that we have this mindset. We want to teach young children and children and young people about their brains, and so they can teach their friends and family. Dan Siegel in the book Brainstorm gives some great examples on how to teach children about the brain. And what I do believe is that when we understand what's happening to us, we actually can cope better, so that when children are experiencing anxiety and depression, they have an understanding of what's happening in their brain and then what's happening in their body as a result of that. It's actually empowering for kids. It takes social emotional learning to a whole new level when kids can start talking about their neuroactivity. We want to ban suspension for elementary students except in extreme cases. I'm being kind because I'm not sure what they are at this moment. Banning them is important because if there is not extreme danger to the student and to others, what we're doing when we suspend kids is we are violating their sense of safety and their sense of community. We have to look at things that happen in our school as the way that tribal wisdom tells us to, is that we are a community. We don't exclude people when something goes wrong, we make it right. And we have to stop using standardized scores to evaluate teachers. It's just kind of my little way of saying, as a former assessment consultant, that this accountability era that we've lived in has caused a whole bunch of trauma for teachers. They're already trauma impacted by a society and by their own lives. We have students coming to us for great needs. Putting accountability, standardized test scores on top of that, we are never going to be able to know what children can do unless we provide these places that are safe, where they feel like they belong, and then we see optimal learning. We provide pre-service and in-service ongoing training for all school staff. Every person who deals with children needs to have trauma awareness, but they also need to know what they can do to help build resilience. We need restorative practices, transformative practices, and a benefit mindset. And finally, just a few short ideas is that this is truly our collective responsibility. We have to get out of the mindset that we have our children pull themselves up by the bootstraps. That doesn't work. This is truly, we know now about trauma affecting an entire community. Bettina Love says that everything that we do in schools and in society really must be rooted in and embrace that which seems impossible. Education for collective dignity and human power for justice. So what could you do today? You can be a change agent right where you stand. You can engage in citizen dialogues. They're happening all over the world. They're happening all over the United States for sure, where we start getting together and we talk like good, rational adults about what we want to see: safe schools, gun control, immigration and refugee crises. We teach and practice deliberation. We teach our students how to solve community problems. They come up with the option and they decide what's best for their school community and for the greater community. We teach and model fair process and other foundations of restorative practice. We make context matter, and when we make context matter, we strengthen our communities. We don't do things in isolation from the community. We bring the community into the school, into the agency. And finally, we need to start communicating with our local decision makers and elected officials. If you don't know who your commissioners are, your elected officials at the state and national level in the United States, this is a good time to find out and to call them. They won't know unless we let them know. So trauma-informed moves us to call to action. we know better, Maya Angelou says we do what we know to do. And when we know better, we do better. And so now we know better. But thank you for this opportunity to be with you today. I hope that, that it's been helpful to you. We've moved from trauma-informed to advocacy and action in a short amount of time. A little bit of trauma awareness, a little bit of resilience and restoration, a little bit of agency and advocacy, and then finally a call to action. If you'd like to contact me at any time, this is how you can reach me. This is my email address, this is my blog, and this is how you can see me on Twitter. And I look forward to connecting with you at a later date.
Thank you, Julie, very much. That was a fantastic hour. You provided us with resources, strategies, and most importantly, inspiration. I thank you. And if everyone would like to hear more from Dr. Julie McDaniel, she will be presenting at this year's International Bullying Prevention Conference, November 7th through 9th in Chicago. We would love for you to join us, and we'll send you more information, and you can also visit us at ibpaworld.org. Thank you, Dr. McDaniel, and thank you, everyone, for joining us.